Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific Affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World, with the aim to bring the leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goals. This is the 17th session of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Happymon Jacob here with us. Dr. Jacob is an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Prior to this, he taught at University of Jammu and Jamia Millia Islamia. He was visiting fellow professor at Hokkaido University, Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, Paris, Sandia National Laboratories, University of Ottawa, Melbourne University, and others. Dr. Jacob serves as member of the International Governing Council of the Nobel Peace Prize winning POGWAS conferences on science and world affairs. He has several publications. Without any further ado, I request Dr. Jacob to take over.
Thank you, Pramod. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, and may I congratulate you once again for this brilliant conference that you have put together. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as the case may be. I am delighted to introduce and chair this panel broadly entitled Indo-Pacific Affairs. There is little doubt that Indo-Pacific easily the most talked about and perhaps the most important strategic concept today. The aggressive rise of China has only quickened the manner in which it has captured attention world over. For India, I mean, since there is no panelist from India on this panel, I mean, I just say a sentence about how India sees it. I think the military standoff with China in the summer of 2020, last year, was a turning point in many ways. I think today there is a lot more articulation and clarity in New Delhi regarding what it wants vis-a-vis China, other great powers, the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. I think the age of uncertainty and the ambivalence may be over. The revival of Quad today is also coinciding with the traction the geopolitical concept of the Indo-Pacific is gaining. And I guess together they make a powerful counter to any attempt at regional hegemony by any country in the Indo-Pacific region. We have an excellent panel this morning, who are also, may I say, very well represented. We have speakers from the United Kingdom, the United States, Japan, and Australia, all important stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific. Let me not stand between you and the excellent speakers we have today. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. We have Professor John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at the Australian National University. He will be speaking on the Australian outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Then we have Professor Yoichiro Sato. He's the Dean of the College of Asian Pacific Studies, Ritsumeikan, Asia-Pacific University. He will be speaking on the competitive economic integration initiatives and major power strategies, followed by Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs and director of Consortium of India-Pacific Researchers. He will address the need to institutionalize the Quad to preserve the international order in the Indo-Pacific, followed by Ms. Cleo Paskal, Associate Fellow, Chatham House in London. She would summarize the findings of a recent report she co-authored entitled Indo-Pacific Strategies, Perceptions, and Partnerships, the view from 7 countries. Seems to be very, very interesting study. I had a brief read of that last night. And Dr. Satoru Nagao, a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute in the United States. He will speak on 3 reasons why America is on the road to win the competition with China. Can't wait to hear that, of course. So we have about, I think, 8 to 9 minutes for each of the speakers. So may I, without further ado, request Professor Blaxland to sort of begin his presentation, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And let me just quickly share my screen with you so you can see what I see. I'm giving an Australian outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and this map speaks volumes. You can see Australia hanging off Southeast Asia. It's centered on Darwin. I've spun it 45 degrees to give you a sense of the space that Australia inhabits. And you can see there on the left-hand side, the Indian Ocean, and on the right-hand side, the Pacific Ocean. This idea of the Indo-Pacific, on one level, from this map, looks like a no-brainer, an obvious kind of deduction to make. I've got in the corner there a little Venn diagram derived from my recent geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, looking at the key factors affecting us and the future of our security prospects. And it boils down to, in my view, to the overlap of great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges, which all affect us all in the Indo-Pacific, to be honest. Let me just move along here. In Australia, there's been some debate. Is it the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific? And what we're seeing is, when you think about the constructs of the 20th century, Asia-Pacific seemed to be the main one. And that was, I think, in part a reflection of the fact that India did not feature so prominently in the East Asian construct, such as the ASEAN-related bodies, the East Asian Summit, and so on. But India has emerged much more prominent in the past. And then from Australia's point of view, we've always had a bit of a blind spot to the Indian Ocean, in part because most of our population is on the southeastern side facing the Pacific. But increasingly, with a series of foreign ministers and defence ministers from the western side of the nation, from Perth, the Indian Ocean has featured more prominently, and that has coincided with the rise of the idea of the Indo-Pacific. For Australia, the American alliance is very prominent in our consciousness, and that speaks to the fact that they are geographically part of the Pacific Ocean and, of course, involved in the Indian Ocean as well. Now, there's some doubt, though, about American leadership, and there's some concerns about whether American ideational leadership, whether the recovery of that is going to happen. We've seen the shambolic response to the pandemic. We've seen domestic political division, a damaged US brand, and the risk, of course, of a reversion to a Trumpian era in perhaps 4 years' time. And the buyout of the United States from these strategic and economic partnership arrangements like the TPP, which has been deeply disconcerting. My colleague Greg Raymond and I have just had this book launched, The US-Thai Alliance and Asian International Relations. I commend it to you. One of the graphs, this survey, we did a survey of 1,800 Thai military officers over 3 years, and this graph shows you how American influence hasn't gone away, but it's been eclipsed by the influence of China. And this speaks volumes to the concerns that many have in the neighbourhood about what the future might hold and the uncertainty arising. Now, Richard Haas, we all know, has talked about the shape of Biden's foreign policies: rebuilding at home, working with allies, embracing diplomacy, participating in international institutions, and so on, a sharp contrast to his predecessor. But of course, this has all happened while we've seen the rise of President Xi and the emergence of wolf warrior diplomacy, the exercise of sharp power, not just against Australia, but against a range of other countries that have dared to cross President Xi. And that's been coupled by a modernisation of the People's Liberation Army on a range of fronts that has deeply unsettled many, and leading to my colleague, Brendan Taylor, to write this book, The Four Flashpoints: How Asia Goes to War, touching on the Korean Peninsula, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan's a really thorny one, and a colleague here in Australia, Lynn Jacobson, has talked about Chinese pressure campaign to force Taiwan unification negotiations, but no individual action by China would warrant a military response. It's like, you know, that China's appreciated that the United States has got a very good hammer, and so it refuses to present a nail. So instead, we're seeing a mix of tactics, military intimidation, disinformation, and cyber attacks that make it very hard for the United States and allies like Australia to counter those moves. I've written a piece recently saying China does not want war, at least not yet, and it's playing the long game. And I think that long game is multifaceted, and it involves cyber attacks, industrial scale cyber attacks, and my universities experienced that, my parliaments experienced that, TV networks here have experienced that, and so forth. One of my PhD students came up with this concept of the spectrum of challenges, with war, conflict, and competition, seeing the spectrum shifting from coercion to persuasion. And across that, we're seeing cyber warfare and what some people are calling grey zone conflict emerging, touching on the edge of war, but not enough to trigger war, and certainly not enough to trigger the application of the US military hammer, if you like. Kishore Mahbubani, who's been featured with a nice program before, has talked in his book, Has China Won? That China is well on the way to becoming the #1 power in the world, and the massive economic ecosystem centered on China is evolving, helped by the fact that the US has bought out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that India's bought out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. My former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd's talked about a managed US PRC strategic competition. He's proposed abstinence from cyber attacks, the US returning to a one China policy, China dialing back its provocations, allowing global economic competition to continue, but collaborating where they can on climate change, on Iran, Iran and North Korea, on the response to the pandemic, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. All of these have implications for Australia. My colleague at the ANU, Hugh White, has talked about Australia distancing itself from America, saying the United States won't win and won't stay, so we should act accordingly. But my sense is perhaps he's being a bit too binary and pessimistic. And he discounts too readily, in my view, the alliance relations and the sunk costs. And I do think that there are other options available, and this is one of the things I'll touch on here. One of the things concerning economics and power, and I believe one of my colleagues on the panel will speak to this in more detail, the enduring dynamics of the US's position and assets are in America's favour, but bolstering military power and alliances is not going to be enough. Economic dynamism and trade partnership are, I believe, key. Looking at Australia's circumstances, we've seen China's economic pressure on Australia really pinch lately, with sanctions on beef, barley, coal, wine, and so on. But one of the things we need to remind ourselves of is that the global economy is not a command economy. There's a global dynamic equilibrium at work, where no one country gets to dictate who gets to buy what and from whom. And what we're seeing is Australia's economic and trade situation has grown regardless. We've actually prospered under the change of circumstances. China's buying more from us than ever before, even with these sanctions. And in addition, Australia has a range of free trade agreements that is seeing us having to reinvest in relationships in the neighbourhood in a way we hadn't thought we needed to. So we've got free trade agreements with Indonesia, with the region, RCEP, CPTPP, Japan, ASEAN, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, the United States, the UK just being finalised now, potentially with India and with the EU as well. So what we're seeing is there's been a view in Australia that, we're facing an inflection point, this is terrible, China's not buying from us anymore. I would contend that the situation is a bit like when Britain joined the European Economic Community in the early 1970s, the precursor to the European Union. Australia worried that we would suffer economically quite severely. In fact, we prospered surprisingly well after they joined the European Economic Community. And my sense is that there are so many other opportunities out there that we will nonetheless continue to prosper. And this is part of what's happened in Australia with our foreign policy white paper. It's now 4 years old, this foreign policy white paper. I called it Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B. And that's because it was about what do you do when you're not sure about what's going to happen with the United States when the Trump administration came into office and when the dynamics, the great power contestational dynamics have shifted so much. So what we're seeing is from an Australian point of view, we're engaging much more in the Indo-Pacific. We're welcoming more American engagement as much as possible. We're bolstering emphasis on the Quad, particularly ties with Japan and India. We're looking to ASEAN as well, as much as possible. Some people call ASEAN a broken reed, and yet it still has remarkable enduring utility. We had an Australian ASEAN Ministerial Summit a couple of years ago. Speaking to that, we've seen an investment in what they call the Pacific Step Up. I would contend it is only one of several steps up that is required. And there is a need to bolster regional economic and trade ties. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing what used to be quite simple, straightforward engagement just with China is now having to be diversified, but still being quite prosperous. On the defence front, we've seen the defence strategic update from a few months back, talking about shaping, deterring and responding and recognising grey zone and cyber and space, and the emphasis on long-range strike and on doubling down on local defence industry. But there's a question, is this enough? I would contend probably not. We've also seen in Australia debate about this confrontation with China. What were we thinking, writes one famous Australian journalist. Australia's policy U-turn on China, it's really, he comes down on it very hard. But yet the concluding remark of a 3-page spread over 3 days in this major Australian newspaper, the Australian Financial Review, he makes the point that outside the rhetoric, it's hard to see how Australia should have managed it differently. Different rhetoric wouldn't have produced a different outcome. The chief obstacle is the aggressive attempt to expand Xi's authoritarianism into the Indo-Pacific. So what do we do about it? Well, we double down on other relationships like the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And there's, I think, a prospect for Australia to have observer status for BIMSTEC, if that's agreeable. What we're seeing in Australia is a remarkable multiculturalization of our society. We got rid of the white Australia policy 54 years ago. Now over a quarter of our population is foreign born, and over 4% of our population is has South Asian heritage. So this is a very interesting dynamic at play here. Australia is diversifying. Our interests in the world around us in the Indo-Pacific are growing. Our trade links with Southeast Asia speak to this as an example. This 10-country grouping of nearly 650 million people is our third largest trading partner with a lot of trading partners, trade agreements. We have about 1 million, until the COVID pandemic, about 1 million visitors from Southeast Asia, about 100,000 students enrolled, and nearly 1 million residents claiming Southeast Asian heritage. We've seen the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific emerge under Indonesian direction especially, and the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific envisages ASEAN centrality as the underlying principle for promoting cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region with ASEAN-led mechanisms central to it. And Australia supports that because we're really keen to see ASEAN work. We see it as a mechanism for Indonesia and other countries in the neighbourhood to continue to have a prominent role that are seen to be congruent with Australia's national interests. Now, Indonesia itself is a country 10 times Australia's population, right next door, third largest democracy, the largest Muslim population in the world, but it's one with which we've had a difficult relationship, one that I think could be made akin to the game of the board game Snakes and Ladders, where we incrementally go up the ladder, only to go down the snake over a range of issues like Timor, beef, boats, spies, clemency, Papua, and yet Australia's security is inextricably linked with Indonesia. So that's very important for us to manage carefully. I'm touched on bolstering the Quad, but it needs to happen beyond its military dimensions. And here's a piece I wrote in the East Asia Forum recently with my colleague Ashok Sharma about the need to go into economic and environmental and cyber and other kinds of cooperation. Now, I know the Quad is contemplating this, but it really needs to double down on that space. Interestingly enough, we're seeing other countries, a lot of NATO countries or from Europe and North America expressing considerable interest in our patch of the world, and that's very welcome. But we're worried about the implications of the pandemic and how we manage the waves of crisis arising, a political and social crisis, the prospect of war, let alone the environmental disaster that might follow. This requires deft diplomacy and politics and management of issues and relationships. So for us, doubling down on ties internationally with the Quad, with the five-power defense arrangement, with ASEAN, with the Indian Ocean Rim Association, with BIMSTEC, the US, Korea, NATO countries. I've also proposed MANIS, is an Indonesian word for sweet, which could be a Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore regional forum. But there's a number of things we can do to bolster international ties. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, an Australian outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I very much appreciate your patience with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Blaxland. May I now request Professor Sato to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to see some of the old friends here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about something Professor Blaxland also talked about, which is the economic dimension of these regional groupings. And as he mentioned, we are in a kind of transition focused between the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, and the rise of India definitely occupies a very important part of this ongoing shift of attention by some of the major players in this region. And as far as the geographical connectivity between the two oceans are concerned, there's nothing really new from Japan's perspective, because Japan has been dependent on petroleum import from the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean sea lane has always been very important for Japan, except that Japan was almost 100% dependent on the US 7th Fleet for protection of safe passage in this region in the past. But in more recent years, Japan is increasing its own security contribution to the safe passage of the vessels in the Indian Ocean region. So, but you know, this recent the change in rhetoric, especially represented by the renaming of the US command from the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command, was not really a new thing for Japan. And in fact, even for the United States, you know, this change of command is nothing new. I remember back in 2007 when I was organizing conference at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies with Ian Story and others, we were already using the Indo-Pacific as a concept in one of those workshops. So the vocabulary communicated by Abe to Trump in 2017, I believe, was already a decade old by that time. So anyway, Japan's continuous interest is to anchor the US commitment to the security and also the economic interest in this region. They go hand in hand. It's very important that the US sees this region not only important region in terms of the maritime geopolitics, which means that by dominating the Pacific Ocean, the US could push the defense perimeter as far west as possible, which is a very geopolitics concept. But in terms of geoeconomics also, if the US geopolitical interests coincide with economic interest in the western part of the Pacific, meaning markets in Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, then the US commitment to the security of this region will be more assured than just geopolitical interest. So for that matter, Japan took a very active role together with Australia at the end of the Cold War in late 1980s to launch APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, to which the United States and other Pacific Rim countries were invited to join. And although Japan and Australia very carefully put ASEAN countries forward in a kind of leadership positions, it was a leadership from behind by these countries. So the US commitment to the economic integration of this region was partly security motivated and partly economics motivated as well. If you're old enough to remember the trade war of the 1980s, and if you have studied the US-Japan bilateral trade disputes as a doctoral dissertation, then you understand what I'm saying very clearly. It was very intense economic competition between Japan and the United States, during which the United States really threatened Japanese access to the US market. And to defend against such unilateral move by the United States, again, Japan had appealed to multilateralism in the region by engaging the US into a greater multilateral framework. It's sort of like tying up Gulliver. US is an economic giant, but by including it into a multilateral framework and disciplining US economic behavior under this multilateral setting was very much behind Japan's attempt to create this Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. We see the same pattern repeating in more recent years, and when New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, and smaller economies were launching TPP, Japan wasn't in the negotiation in the early stage. Japan waited until the United States joined the negotiation. Then Japan joined the negotiation. Okay. So Japan was not willing to negotiate. Neither US was willing to negotiate bilateral free trade between the two countries. But Japan joined the multilateral TPP as soon as the US joined. And within that framework, again, Japan tried to ensure the US commitment to regional economic integration and more disciplined free trade in the region-wide integration. Well, as you know, Trump put the US out and Japan's calculation didn't go as it planned. But of course, Japan wasn't betting on just one agreement. Japan was concurrently negotiating RCEP. And in fact, RCEP negotiation and TPP negotiations were leveraged, mutually leveraged. So the progress in one encourages the other negotiation to also go deeper into liberalization. So it was very important that the TPP is happening when Japan was trying to liberalize the RCEP grouping, especially against China's resistance to go fully into free trade. So Japan did sign RCEP. Japan is still hoping that the US would return to TPP, well, CPTPP now. But if you understand the US ratification process and all that in the Congress executive dynamics, it's quite unlikely to see any US return to TPP anytime soon. But of course, the Trump very cleverly, quickly put pressure on Japan to negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement. And the US has already recovered some of the would-be gains which US was supposed to gain under TPP by imposing those conditions on Japan in the bilateral setting, like the beef tariff concession Japan offered in TPP was already matched by the United States. I mean, US was not entitled to get that kind of concession, but the US complained because US could no longer compete against Australian beef. And so this kind of behavior by the US goes against a closer quadrilateral partnership, because without the fully committing economically, the solidarity among the Quad members will always face this kind of skepticism by America's trade partners, including Japan. So what will happen in the coming years? I think, let me just share the screen here. And I do have some fancy slides here. Okay. So the Indo-Pacific as an economic group is already bigger than the European Union or North American group, and is only expected to grow further with faster population growth and faster economic growth in many of those member countries, except Japan, of course. So Japan sees itself as a shrinking but significant player within the world's biggest and fast-growing grouping. So Japan's strategy is to take a hitch ride on this growing economic bloc and negotiate the best deal vis-a-vis the other two groups, namely the European Union and the North American group. With European Union, Japan already signed the free trade agreement, economic partnership agreement formally. And if Japan managed to bring the US into TPP again, that will serve Japan's economic interest. So the kind of world Japan is looking at in the medium term is the world in which China, India become the #1, #2 economies, together with the growing presence of Indonesia and other, the so-called emerging 7 countries. Excuse me, sorry, here. the table shows Japan's trade agreement when it was signed, and also you can see a similar pattern unfolding in terms of strategic agreement. Japan is not only signing those economic agreements, but also expanding the network of strategic partnerships with Quad countries and beyond. I would call it Quad Plus. And UK, France, Canada, they already have signed AXA, for example, and this facilitates joint military exercises and other joint activities. Australia's case, Japan and Australia are as close as ever, and Australia is already next to the United States as the closest defense partner. So what we are seeing is bifurcation at the strategic security chessboard and economic chessboard. But the pattern of alignment are not yet identical. It really depends on how China behaves. If China threatens India continuously, and then the India may gravitate more toward the other members of Quad. But if China disciplines itself in terms of threatening neighbors, then China's economic power will speak to the future of regional integration, and China will continue to be included economically. So the kind of the supply chain realignment the US is talking about depends on how China behaves in the security front, and also it depends on how the private sector responds to the call by the government. Looking at, for example, the ongoing restructuring of the semiconductor industry, I see that the private sectors are not blindly listening to the governments. They have their own the profit motivations, and relocation of the production and research facilities are driven by those business considerations for most. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sato-san. That was a brilliant presentation. May I now request Dr. Gunasekara-Rockwell to take the floor, please.
Thank you. Happy to do so. I'm going to be talking about the institutionalization of the Quad and Quad Plus. But before I get started, because I'm a government employee of the United States government, I have to put my disclaimer in here that the views and opinions expressed or implied in this presentation are solely mine. That'll probably be pretty obvious after I get going. But they do not carry the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the United States government. And now that I've got that out of the way, one of the ways that I'd like to look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific and in the Quad and Quad Plus in particular, or where we ought to be going with it, is through the DIME construct, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And I think others have spoken to the need to have a holistic approach to the Indo-Pacific. And I think this particular approach offers a promising way of doing so. Obviously, each of the governments involved in the Quad and the wider Quad Plus, we've got a lot of crossover and a lot of synergy then amongst each of the programs that we're promoting in those areas. As mentioned earlier, Australia's got the Pacific Step Up. India's got Act East, Neighborhood First policy, and things of that nature. Japan's got the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And we've got a plethora of things here in the States, including our hub and spoke system of alliances in the region. And because there's a lot of synergy there, there's a lot of duplication of effort that could be streamlined if we were to institutionalize the Quad. Information-wise, same thing. You know, we've got Australia and the United States are members of Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing and gathering organization. Japan's expressed interest in it in the past, and you know, India would make a logical addition to that that grouping as well. And this would help us then tackle some of the disinformation campaign coming out of Beijing and elsewhere. We've got military cooperation that exists already that could be deepened and streamlined. And this includes, you know, all of the different policies that we've been talking about, the Defense Strategic Update for Australia, SAGAR, and the standing up of the Defense Space Agency and Space Force. And I think Australia is getting ready to stand up a Space Force as well. And Japan's talking about the Space Domain Mission Unit being ready to go by 2023. So these are all areas where we could, you know, work together to cut costs, to streamline processes, and to, you know, start engaging in meaningful operation or interoperability beyond the rhetoric. Economic, you know, much has been talked about the chances that America has missed recently in terms of RCEP and CTPP and things of that nature. But there's other things out there as well. Australia, Japan, and us working on the Blue Dot Network. You know, the India and Japan working together on the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Things of this nature that, you know, if we were to institutionalize the Quad, we could better coordinate our efforts and streamline processes and reduce the amount of cost that each one of us is pouring into each of these things. And I'll get to eventually talking about, you know, how we're going to get there. But, you know, we don't want this to be just a military organization. Another treaty out there that you know, it's often been said that it's going to be a NATO in the Indo-Pacific, and you know, it doesn't have to be. But at the same time, it does need to be a component of it. I don't know that others agree with me, but I haven't seen anything in China's behavior of recent to give us any reason to believe that Xi plans to change the belligerent nature that China has been displaying over the last couple of years. And two, if we look towards what kind of major weapon systems are going to be around in 2030 to 2040, and obviously I'm going to focus a little bit on the military because that's where I'm from. You know, we have to worry a little bit about the amount of money that China is pouring into its military and what exactly it is that they're hoping to do with that. For example, a recent article that was published in our journal by Justin Deal had to deal with comparing. One of the things it did was compare some the platforms, and so if you look at our fifth generation fighters, by 2030 to 2040 timeframe, we're going to be looking at that's the one area that the Quad would have a distinct advantage over of China. China to have about 200 probably, and we'd have about 1,500. But if you look at bombers, altogether, we'd have 88, they'd have 150 to 172, almost double what we've got. Major surface combatants, we'd have 166, they'd have 150, almost on parity there. Submarines, we'd have 83, they'd have 70. Aircraft carriers, we'd have 8, they'd have 2, and that's with only 2 of the Quad countries having aircraft carriers at that time. And so it's a little bit disconcerting that you know, people are completely nixing the idea that there should be a strong military component in the Quad, and I understand that, you know, some of that's driven by economic factors and whatnot. But at any rate, obviously there's some things that are missing in this particular analysis too. There's no taking into account the number of unmanned aerial vehicles and things of that nature. Some of the emerging technologies that are coming out there that could level the playing field and kind of do away with some of these imbalances in the more conventional and traditional forms of weapons platforms. But at any rate, so what are some of the hurdles then to institutionalization? I'd say each of the countries in the Quad brings a couple of those to the table. For India, this lingering sense of non-alignment, and it's become almost sacrosanct among some in the government and in intelligentsia. And non-alignment has been the rule of thumb since independence, but it doesn't really have that long of a history before that in Indian foreign policy. And so the idea that you need to be shackled to it is probably something that should be re-examined. Take stock of exactly what it is that non-alignment has brought to India since independence, and what abandoning it would bring it instead. So just a kind of cost-benefit analysis thing there that I think would warrant them, India, considering moving away from it. Also, something that kind of stifles India's ability to fully commit to the Quad is the interoperability of their systems with ours, with the other members of the Quad. 90% of India's defense acquisitions have been Russian or Soviet-made weapons. And so when we do all of these joint exercises and talk about, perhaps moving forward joint commands and that sort of thing, there's a disconnect between what we can and can't do, or would like to and can do in terms of the weapon systems themselves. Obviously part of the reason that India has that is because we didn't provide them with the technology to make things domestically with Western systems, and Russia was willing to do that. So I fully recognize the fact that it's not entirely New Delhi's fault for that, but we could turn that around and maybe provide that assistance if we were to institutionalize. For Japan, I would say the pacifist nature of the Constitution presents a hurdle similar to the non-alignment of India, with a large segment of the society not wishing to do away with that and become entangled in a military, or an alliance that has anything to do with the military, if you will. And then, of course, the demographics, which Sato-san had mentioned earlier. Japan's getting older, and Japan's immigration policy is not very liberal in terms of letting others come in from outside. And these are people who could serve in the military in ways that they do in other countries. But that's not the case right now. From Australia, I would say, anemic platforms. If you go back to what I was talking about before, look, Australia's got no bombers, and they've got no aircraft carriers. So what exactly do they bring to the table in terms of the military side of the house? Obviously, they bring a lot in terms of diplomacy. They bring a lot in terms of information sharing, and a lot in terms of economics, but the military component's a little bit lighter there. And then the dependency of the economy on China. But as Professor Blaxland pointed out, they've been trying to address that by branching out since their confrontation with Australia, and trying to diversify their economic balance, and that's a good thing. And then with the United States, and this too has somewhat been addressed, inconsistent diplomacy and trust issues. How can you trust that we're going to continue to pour any interest into the Indo-Pacific? And I would say, Trump actually showed more interest in the Indo-Pacific than what he's sometimes given credit for. And I think the fact that we're in Quad 2.0, or some would say 3.0, is illustrative of that. And I would also say that, the current administration provides some lip service and, created a nice fancy new office for it, but what have they actually done so far? And, a lot of the people that are in those positions and filling those new offices are the same people who helped orchestrate the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration that never really materialized. And so these are some of the issues that we have to overcome if we're to sell this idea that we're going to institutionalize the Quad. So what are some of the desired end states? Create a mutual, I would say a holistic treaty that has some defense built into it. Something akin to the defunct SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that invites all like-minded nations of the Indo-Pacific to safeguard the security and prosperity of the region against any aggressors, and whether they be state or non-state, and streamlines development programs to avoid redundancy and ensure transparency. And also to reify the definition of the Indo-Pacific to include all the subregions of the region. And I say this because, just as Professor Blaxland mentioned earlier, that Australia had a blind spot for a particular portion of the region at a certain time. I'd say that we still have a pretty big blind spot when it comes to the Indian side, Indian Ocean's side of the equation as well. We changed the name to Indo-Pacific Command, but if you look at what Indo-Pacific Command's actually what its theater actually is, it ends at the west coast of India, and that leaves a whole wide swath of the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific that it belongs to somebody else's area of responsibility. And yes, they do cross pollinate and speak with one another on it and everything, but it does seem to, in some ways, truncate our policies based on this kind of division of the geography amongst the commands, and to a lesser extent, the State Department. And I think then, America especially needs to get on board with, understanding a wider definition of it, and especially the DoD does. And so then we could create Quad institutions for tackling issues like international terrorism, cybersecurity, trafficking, and so forth, many of the issues that my colleagues have already brought up. Shift supply chains from China to India and other Indian Ocean Rim Association or treaty nations, incentivized by other Quad governments. Shift Indian defense acquisitions toward Western platforms through joint ventures and production, and expand Five Eyes to Japan and India to enhance intelligence and information sharing. And the bottom line being transform rhetoric, which is pretty much what we've had since the reinstitution of the Quad in 2017, to actual action. And I've got a lot more that I could talk about as far as what the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was. It did have, while militarily it was a failure, there were a lot of things that were accomplished in terms of hosting military exercises, working together to strengthen economic foundations and living standards in Southeast Asian nations, sponsoring a variety of meetings and exhibitions on cultural, religious, and historical topics, sponsored fellowships for Southeast Asian scholars, and then created some schools and research centers throughout the region as well. And so it was more of a holistic treaty than what we give it credit for. And I think if we were to take then that shell of the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, see what worked, look at what didn't work, look at NATO as well, and see what would translate well from NATO to the Indo-Pacific, we could come up with something that would accomplish what all of the Quad nations are looking for. And obviously there would have to be give and take. And I think, the United States needs to realize that we are living in a multipolar world, and, be a part of that conversation with that sort of mindset, rather than coming into it as the bull in the China cabinet. So I'll leave it at that. And hopefully, once we get to question and answer, I'll be able to flesh out anything that anybody else has to ask about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rockwell, for that very, very action-oriented sort of a presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions in the Q&A on that. Over to you, Ms. Paskal.
Thank you very much. These are some hard acts to follow, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Jaiswal and NICE for this incredible thing that they've organized. It really has been extremely useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research outcomes from a 2-year project we did at Chatham House, looking at perceptions of strategic shifts in the Indo-Pacific, because the countries' perceptions of each other underlie a lot of what we've just been talking about, how effectively we can build partnerships or not, and looking at each of the countries in terms of how they view the other and where the barriers are, the real barriers, and the barriers that have been created by political warfare by third parties to create artificial barriers in order to make it more difficult to build those partnerships. So what we did is we selected 7 countries that had growing interest or were in the Indo-Pacific: the US, the UK, France, India, the Kingdom of Tonga, Japan, and China, and held workshops and discussions with the strategic communities and partnerships with think tanks in each of those countries. In India, we were very lucky to have as our partner Gateway House, and I think some of the people who helped us with the research are on this call. I'd like to thank them very much. We did the workshops and the field research between September 2019 and March 2020. So we flew out of Tokyo on March 2020. So it was before the world changed, BC, before COVID. And it was a very useful baseline, actually. And what we found was across all 7 countries, except for 6 countries, except for China, talk about China separately, there were 3 dynamics at play in terms of the development of the strategies towards the Indo-Pacific. The first was there were a lot of internal divisions about how to deal specifically with China, which is, of course, the central point for how you're developing your Indo-Pacific strategy. And it was, as has been mentioned before, essentially a division between the economic and political communities, because the economic community gives a lot of money to the political community in democracies particularly, and the defense strategic and intelligence communities, who were much more concerned about China. So political and economic communities wanted to figure out how to work with China more effectively, and the defense, security, intelligence communities were much more concerned about that. So that internal division was there everywhere, and we saw the kind of touchstone topics were Huawei, for example, where a country would go on Huawei. There's certain things that kept popping up all over the place. The second thing that we found all over was uncertainty, very, very high levels of uncertainty. So in the UK, it was Brexit. In the US, it was the upcoming presidential election. There were major events, and we heard over and over that things were more uncertain than they had ever felt before, and this was before COVID. And the result of that, those internal divisions and the uncertainty, were countries were hedging as much as they possibly could. They were putting off making decisions. They were trying to keep their options open as much as they could. So that was that 6 months of field research. Then came COVID, the world shut down, and a whole series of other events happened. We had the increasing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the blocking of the information around COVID coming out of Taiwan, the tariffs against Australia, the punitive tariffs against Australia, and in the case of India, the horrific events up at Galwan, where 20 Indian soldiers were ambushed and killed. And as was mentioned, as you mentioned, Dr. Jacobs, that was an event that really, I think, changed not only India, but possibly the entire Indo-Pacific. I think that was an event that we may look back on it as a sort of, shooting of Archduke Ferdinand type moment, where suddenly things changed at a really fundamental level. Because what we saw was India has, yes, it has a whole non-aligned movement, and it has an issue with Russia and has all that sort of stuff, but it also has an extremely informed and very sophisticated defense, intelligence, and security community that were given the room to move all of a sudden. And so one of the first moves that happened as a result of Galwan was the banning of the Chinese apps, 59 apps. Suddenly that cut off the intelligence flow, all sorts of stuff. We can go into why the apps are important for another reason. Also, they're rolling up us on the spy networks. There was a blocking of Chinese FDI. The Indian approach to China dramatically changed internally, created a comprehensive national defense to China's comprehensive national power, but it also allowed for India to start signing a bunch of international agreements like BECA with the US and AXA with Japan, and rolling with the Quad with Malabar in a way that we hadn't seen before. So what we ended up with, kind of a year after March 2020, when the field research stopped, in March 2021, suddenly we were seeing a lot less internal divisions. More countries were willing to make decisions about Huawei, for example, like the UK did. We saw less international uncertainty. The sky didn't fall when Brexit happened, and a little bit less hedging. The issue now is, so we've seen that momentum shift. The perceptions of the partners, the importance of the partners to each other have shifted. you know, India looks more important to the U.S. The U.S. looks more important to India. You know, we're looking at each other a little bit differently. But those elements of political warfare that are in place and the elite capture that's in place hasn't gone away. So there's momentum, but it's not inevitable, which is why kind of some of these ideas, for example, that Professor Gunasekara-Rockwell brought up about ways of institutionalizing it while the window is still open will be essential, I think, if we're going to keep this ball rolling. So we've seen a fundamental shift over the last 2 years of at least the research that we've been looking at the way that the Indo-Pacific is looked at externally and functions internally, and will be undoubtedly going to be going through more changes over the next year or two. And the direction it goes in is going to depend a lot on perceptions of other countries, and it's going to depend a lot on the smaller countries, the relatively smaller countries like Nepal or like Singapore or like Malaysia. So that's one of the reasons why I'm particularly grateful to NICE for having a seminar and this topic on now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Paskal. I can tell you that I'm in agreement with most of what you said. It resonates very well, you know, here sitting in New Delhi. May I now request Dr. Nagao-san to sort of make his presentation, please.
Thank you. I will use the PowerPoint.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying. Wait a second. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint? No problem? Okay. Okay, thank you very much for giving a chance to speak in front of such a prominent expert of Nepal, India, Japan, and US, and Australia, and Japan also. It is honor for me. Title of my presentation is 3 reasons why America is on the road to win the competition with China. So US-Chinese relations are becoming increasingly tense. China has been stimulously provoking many countries, and the US has stepped up to counter this behavior. But for other countries in the world, the most important question influencing long-term planning is which side is likely to prevail, the US or China? Indeed, there are 3 reasons why the US is on the road to win the competition with China. America is far more popular than China. America is still more powerful than China. And America has a long-term plan to defeat China. Firstly, America is far more popular than China. The number of formal treaty-based alliances the US has entered into just one indication of this. The US has many formal allies, including NATO, Central and South American countries, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, 52 in total. But China's only formal ally is North Korea. Indeed, this popularity is very important factor in determining which side eventually dominates. For example, in World War I, the winning side comprised 32 countries, but losing side was comprised of just 4 countries. In World War II, 54 versus 8. In the US-Soviet Cold War, 54 versus 26. Secondly, America is still more powerful than China. The United States National Security Strategy was published in December 2017. Latest one is 2070. My new one will come, but not yet. and clearly labeled China as a challenger. So since then, the US-China high-tech war, trade war, or military confrontation have escalated. But that time, US spent more on research and defense. US is more on research and development, not defense, research and development. And US still leading GDP. And the US spent more on defense. That is 2018. So recently, the Center for Economic and Business Research in UK predicted that China will overtake the US to becoming the world's largest economy by 2018. But that hasn't happened yet. On March 25th this year, US President Joe Biden remarked in his first press conference, China have an overall goal to becoming a leading country in the world, wealthiest country in the world, and most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen. So if the US accelerates its effort now, it will gain an advantage over China. Thirdly, America has a long-term plan to defeat China. There is a strong possibility that US has a long-term plan to win the competition with China, and its recent policy to counter China's provocations indicates strategic consistency. The US policy toward China has three aspects. Militarily, the US has tried to maintain a balance, but economically, US has tried to decouple from China and reduce its budgetary advantages. And in the humanitarian realm, the US has demanded that China respect Western value. So indeed, there is a strong possibility that such a tough stance toward China will remain long-term policy for three reasons. First, Republicans or Democrats have a similar view on China. For example, the high-tech war, which banned products from the Huawei and ZTE, started when investigating report on the US national security issue posted by Chinese telecommunication companies, Huawei and ZTE, was published in 2012 during the Barack Obama presidency. The Biden administration has not changed the essence of the China policy that the Trump administration developed. So Republicans and Democrats share many similar goals toward China. And secondly, during its 245 years history, the US has taken only 169 years to transform from a single colony of British Empire into the world-only superpower, and it's maintained this status for 76 years. During this time, all rivals of the United States, including Germany, Japan, and Soviet Union, disappeared. So we can learn a lesson from this history. During the World War II, the US has an Orange Plan to defeat Japan and implemented it. But when these plans are declassified in 1974, the world was surprised to learn that there was also a Red Plan to defeat Britain and Canada. So Canada was very upset that time. So because the US designates China as a competitor in the national security challenge strategy in 2017, this is a public document, we can assume that it has a contingency plan to defeat China as a part of long-term strategy. So therefore, America is far more popular, still more powerful, and has a long-term plan to win the competition with China. The rest of the world must not forget these facts and we set up our own strategy accordingly. Simply state, cooperation with the US is beneficial and in our own national interest. Thank you very much. That's my presentation. I should finish. Okay. Okay, give me some time to finish.
You'll find the stop button somewhere. Stop.
Yeah, I am searching the button. Maybe this one. Yeah, okay. Finally, thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Nagao-san. Pramod, are there any questions from Facebook or any other place? We have one question in the chat box, but if there are other questions, please feel free to send them to us. We have two questions actually. So the first question is to you, Dr. Ernest. I mean, how would global supply chain shifting from mainland China to other countries, including Southeast Asia, affect geopolitical calculus and security dynamics, both from Quad and Chinese perspective? And the next one is to Ms. Paskal. In your analysis, Taiwan or Galwan, which is going to determine the world politics in coming years? Right, I think let's take these questions and then look for others. Over to you, Dr. Ernest Gunasekara.
Okay, so that's a whopper of a question there. You know, obviously it would open up a big can of worms if we were to shift the supply chain from China to anywhere. But I think it would shift things in our favor in terms of winning friends and influencing people in Southeast Asia if we were to include them as part of the transition. You know, we haven't always taken ASEAN as seriously as we ought to. In fact, I don't believe that the president has so far called on any of the heads of state of ASEAN. If he has, it's been fairly recently, and I just didn't catch it. But you know, 6 months into your term, and you haven't spoken with these folks with any regularity, it definitely shows that we need to do something to show them that we're serious about those economies and making friends amongst those folks. And I think too, you know, if we're talking about taking all of these building blocks or Lego pieces that are out there in the Indo-Pacific and putting them together into some kind of overarching institution, you know, doing this by putting our economic clout where it serves a purpose it speaks volumes. And yeah, it's going to irritate the crud out of Beijing, but you know, they've kind of brought it on themselves, and you know, we will have to deal with the ramifications of them throwing a tantrum about it probably. But I think an institutionalized Quad Plus would be up to the task.
Thank you. There are two questions to you, Ms. Paskal. One is the one I had just read out, and the other is China's influence growing in South Pacific and Africa? If you could take these questions, we can then take some of the others.
Thank you very much. So the Galwan is reporting. So I can report based on our research the impact that Galwan had. Taiwan is projecting. So just to be different, we know the effect so far that Galwan has had, and it has been substantial. Taiwan, in my personal opinion, is a huge issue, because if Taiwan falls to the PRC, then you're going to see a cascading effect through the whole region. And Japan has been very clear that its security is directly linked to Taiwan. I mean, it blows a hole through the first island chain. It allows power projection much further out, but more importantly, in the context of this perception issue, it undermines any credibility the U.S. would have as a reliable partner in the region. So the fall of Taiwan, there's somebody, Colonel Grant Newsham, a former retired U.S. Marine Corps, wrote a paper on this that basically said Taiwan goes red, the rest of the region goes red or at least pink. Right? It's a really terrifying scenario. In terms of the South Pacific, in fact, I think the question was from Captain Bansal, who knows this topic much better than I do, and I would link it into the other question about Make in India, because yes, China is making huge advances in Africa and the South Pacific, in large part through low-cost economic engagement, which is where India can offer competition that the West can't offer, which is why India is under severe political warfare attack from China. That's why the iPhone parts manufacturing plant in Bengaluru was attacked, and the images went out over social media within hours, because it is imperative for China to create the impression that India is not a reliable place to relocate supply chains, because India economically is the only one that can displace China throughout the region. So Make in India isn't just an Indian issue. It is a deep strategic issue for the entire Indo-Pacific. The low-cost pharmaceuticals coming out of India can keep Africa afloat in a way that expensive Western pharmaceuticals can't, and Chinese unreliable pharmaceuticals can't either. So India's economic engagement across the Indo-Pacific, which is why the Quad vaccine diplomacy thing would have been great if it would have worked, if we wouldn't have had the Defense Production Act restrictions on the export of the raw materials for vaccines, would be exactly the sort of thing, again, that Dr. Gunasekara-Rockwell was talking about, where you bring together those economic aspects to underpin the strategic engagement that is necessary to create the sort of situation where you feel secure enough in Australia, for example, to think that you can hitch yourself a little bit more to the US in many of these different sectors.
Thank you. There is this question about India as the manufacturing hub in IOR. Sato-san, I was wondering if you want to sort of take that question very briefly. I also want to add another question to it. You made a, differentiating between the US and the Chinese strategies in the region. You spoke about limited bifurcation in the security architecture and integration in the economic architecture. Now, the question that I have is basically, can this duality in dealing with China, for instance, continue as the Chinese economic power grows? Is China going to really accept that duality? You can sort of, in the security sphere, deal with the United States and its allies, and when it comes to economy, you deal with us. Is that going to be something that is acceptable to China as the Chinese economic power grows? Sato-san, if you could take these two questions, that'd be grateful.
Thank you very much. The first question, how can India take advantage of the production relocation from China? I think for India to receive some of those the transplants from China, I think India needs to improve its competitiveness in terms of labor productivity. And the China was really suitable for manufacturing operations because of this well-educated and disciplined labor. And can India offer the same at a competitive cost? I think that's something. It depends on the what part of India as well. And I think the education is very critical in that regard. The second question about this duality, I think countries like Japan have an interest in maintaining this duality. In other words, trying to avoid bifurcation, because when the US economic strategy based on US security strategy dominates the region, the kind of the economic cost to US allies, particularly Japan, is just prohibitively high. The US high-tech war, not only hurts China, it hurts Japan, it hurts Taiwan, it hurts Korea, and unless US pays due attention to those costs and try to minimize the collateral damage to its own allies, Japan is not going to go along with a high-tech war like that. The semiconductor is a good example. Trying to hurt China by isolating it, the countries like Japan, Korea also suffer because the electronics component Japan, Korea are selling to China are assembled in China and exported into the United States. And this becomes more like US versus East Asia rather than US versus China.
Right. There is, in fact, one more question concerning Japan. How does Japan plan to secure its sea lanes for commercial ships if the US narrows its Asian strategy to solely focus on China? I was wondering if Nagao-san or Sato-san want to take that question before we move on to Professor John.
So, okay, can I first, Professor Sato, could you please allow me to say? Thank you very much, sir. My answer is, when we think about the safeguard of the sea lane of communications, which country or what kind of organization is a threat for sea lane of communications? Firstly, China is a threat. If China sends a submarine and show their power to attack the sea lane of communications, China can claim they are the security provider of the sea lane of communication. They show their influence as a guardian of the safe sea lane of communication. That kind of image leads China to be the leading country of the world. That is not acceptable for Japan. So that is the reason. If US focusing on China, for Japan, there's no problem. This to safeguard the sea lane communications, China is the most important threat for Japan. And if US focusing on China, there's no problem. But to deal with piracy or sea-based terrorists, indeed, same framework is useful to deal with. If India take charge as a security provider in the Indian Ocean, the ship came to Japan, can secured by Indian Navy. So Quad is useful anyway. So simply said, my answer is there is no problem. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I share Nagao-san's optimism as well. I think it's not going to be a kind of extreme that the US will completely pull out of the Indian Ocean region. I think it's just that its relative weight will gradually decline. And as China's presence rises, the US power will be supplemented by the growing presence of other players aligned with the United States, such as Japan. And I hesitate to use the word alignment to describe India, but India has been working, with US and Japanese navies, and now with Australians and Europeans and Indians are also working together. So this kind of the Quad Plus framework is going to supplement the relative decline of US power projection in the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you so much, Professor Blaxland. There's a question for you, if you could, on cyber attack and security and AI, if you could answer that.
So I'm looking for the question.
Regarding cyber and tech security, what could be the comprehensive strategies regarding the use of AI, where global policy about AI-driven surveillance, security, AI ethics, and global data policy framework can be instrumentalized, I suppose that means. So it's a quite complicated question, but if you do make sense of that.
So AI is affecting us all. Artificial intelligence is affecting us all. It's affecting how we conduct intelligence, how we surveil, how we monitor, how we protect ourselves, how our societies operate. And in an open society like Australia, Western countries that pride themselves on, liberal democratic countries that pride themselves on having checks and balances on authority and on the power of the state over individuals and the power of the state over neighbouring states. It's actually really important to make sure that there are checks and balances in place, that there are appropriate checks and balances in place. I've written a little bit in domestic Australian context about checks and balances in the intelligence community. If you are empowering the state to conduct surveillance and to monitor behaviour of your citizens, you need to make sure that there are robust checks and balances to the abuse of power, because these new technologies are really super enabling governments to take decisions and to pursue policy objectives that sometimes trample over people's rights. Internationally, this is a real challenge as well. And what we're seeing is, from an Australian point of view, the view has been taken that Australia is a middle power that essentially gains considerable benefit by collaborating with allies, particularly the United States, but others as well. And here, the intelligence arrangements with the United States and with the Five Eyes are fundamentally seen as giving Australia advantage, relative advantage. And I think one can see opportunities for such collaboration to be extended to Quad partners, Japan and India, and to other neighbours who are operating in good faith and who are looking to collaborate with Australia. So Australia, for instance, is looking bilaterally and multilaterally to engage on a range of issues that capitalise on improved surveillance, responsiveness, and technological advances. Here I'm talking about countering terrorism, people smuggling, drug smuggling, and provocative great power contestational challenges. So there's a number of dimensions to that issue, to that question that we could talk, at length about. But I'll stop there and open the floor to other questions and other comments.
Thank you. There is another question for Dr. Gunasekara-Rockwell. How do you see India's relations with the US grow closer when the US is shutting the doors for India to interact with its all-time friends such as Iran and Russia with its sanctions on these countries? I think that's an interesting question. This is again something that New Delhi has to grapple with. I have another question for you while you sort of take that question. You did talk about the institutionalizing of Quad. I think that's an interesting idea. Now, I mean, you didn't have enough time to sort of elaborate on some of the structural aspects of it, but if you could sort of take us through some of the elementary structural elements of institutionalizing it that you have in mind, especially because there is this increasing talk about Quad Plus and all of that. So, so if you could answer these two questions, one on Iran and Russia and India's relations with them, and this the structural elements of institutionalizing the Quad and Quad Plus as well. Thank you.
I'll try my best. So obviously, everybody's coming into this equation with different friends, right? And sometimes when you make new relationships, old relationships change. India's closeness with Russia is kind of a relic of the Cold War to some extent. And again, I think it goes largely back to the willingness of the Soviet Union to work with the Indian defense industry in building up India's domestic production. But and it has helped you out. I can't say otherwise. Obviously, if we're not going to help you with Western powers aren't willing to help you build your own domestic production lines and whatnot, it's problematic for you to emerge out, in a post-colonial construct. but that said, is that relationship worth maintaining at the level that it is now if the systems that are coming out of those production lines are subpar? And I would say that the Russian systems are definitely inferior to what we're producing in the West, not just in America, but in Israel and in Europe. And so, revisiting that relationship and seeing, what you want to keep out of it and what you want to change about it, I think is a valid thing to do. In terms of the relationship with Iran, and we've had some direct messaging with the questioner here, who brings up, the port that you, Chabahar, that India is working with Iran on. Obviously, it has some strategic importance to it, especially given Gwadar and everything that is for Pakistan and China. And I would say probably more China now that Pakistan's not going to be able to pay its debts. We're going to end up with a Hambantota sort of situation there where China owns Gwadar. I think that's pretty much inevitable. I understand it to a point, but at the same time, Iran is a sponsor of international terrorism, and so any relationship that you're having with them that's pumping money into their economy, in some regards, comes back to bite you in the rear because some of that money is going into funding terrorism. So I would say that would be definitely a relationship worth revisiting as well. Are there other places, other ports that maybe India would be better off pouring their money into, especially now that Iran and China are building closer relationships too? That might be something that we see that India might want to revisit and say, maybe that was money ill spent. And maybe the Quad and Quad Plus construct would afford us the opportunity then to partner with India in building a port somewhere else that could compete with Gwadar instead. In terms of what I envision for institutionalization, I think the best thing is to kind of go back to my analogy of the Lego blocks. And we've got bits and pieces that are scattered throughout the Indo-Pacific that just aren't plugged into a centralized construct, a centralized institution. And I think, if we were able to then kind of build, when you build Legos, you've got the big plate that you like to build all the little pieces onto to create something, right? So Quad could be that big master plate that you could then build, take pieces from IORA, take pieces from ASEAN, take pieces from all of these other acronyms that are out there in the Indo-Pacific, and build something meaningful on top of that platform then that would be the Quad. And I think taking like I said, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization as an example and see what worked and what didn't work, and trying to build on that skeletal framework, then something that was of worth would be worth a worthy approach to doing so.
Thank you so much. I think there's an interesting question about the role of Russia in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in containing or counterbalancing China. That's a complex answer right there. I mean, given the improvement in the Sino-Russian relations and China's own unhappiness about the whole Indo-Pacific construct aspect. So anyone wants to sort of answer that question, please, Ms. Paskal.
I do, because I've been following the little S400 game for a little while, right? So this is a big issue, and it's a question. There's the issue of the equipment that you already have, and then there's the issue of the equipment you're going to get, and who else has that same equipment you're going to get, and who is working with the people you're buying the equipment you're going to be getting from. And it really comes down to the fundamental question of what you think the relationship between Russia and China is. And it seems to be different in different parts of the world, but on the India border, it seems to be much more comfortable than I would like to see if I was sitting in Delhi. And that S400 it's not a missile killer, it's an alliance killer. It's designed, once it goes in, it will affect the ability of India to have high-tech cooperation in large areas with the US for a long time, generationally. And, you'll have Russians in and out of the country or accessing that information. So it's in not just China's interest, Russia's interest, but China's interest for India to take the S-400, which of course it has installed along the line of actual control on the Chinese side already, and which it seems to be co-developing the S-500 with Russia. So if you're tracking, for me, when I'm trying to understand how close Russia and China are, I look at two things. I look at high-tech cooperation, which in defense and in space, which seems to be getting closer. And I look at where the Russians are hiding their money, and more of it is going to Macau than it used to, which implies to me they feel pretty comfortable with the regime that's in power in Beijing at the moment. So I don't think Russia is necessarily a stabilizing force in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we're going to have to try to get a better understanding of how close Beijing and Moscow are, and if there are places that they can be split apart, great. But it's a distrust and verify situation as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer to that question right there. There's one question, I think that should be our last question. We are now nearing the time allotted to us. This is specifically addressed to Professor John Blaxland, but I think others could also come in on this if they wish to. How is India going to meet US expectation in its east on China when the US has not met India's expectations that the US would reduce India's threat from its west, from Afghanistan and Pakistan? And how difficult is it for India to focus on Indo-Pacific when India is now caught in a security threat from both its east and west? I think that's a very legitimate question that often you get asked in Delhi. India has concerns about Pakistan and what's going to happen in Afghanistan and how it will impact Kashmir. And on the other hand, you're in a situation with the Chinese. So the Indian ability to focus on Indo-Pacific would, to some extent, at least be reduced by these realities in the West. And at a time that is a reality, you have a talk between the United States and Pakistan, as it were, because the Americans also want to ensure that everything doesn't go all that crazy in Afghanistan. So I think this is again a complicated question. Professor John or others who would want to come in on this, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Look, the thing is that India is going to act in the pursuit of its national interests. All countries do. What we're seeing, though, is the confluence of factors pointing to overlapping interests. And as Cleo was pointing out in relation to the S-400, India has to decide for itself whether its interests are best served by the pursuit of Russian technology or in pursuing a look east policy, engaging in Southeast Asia, and in managing its relationship with Pakistan and Afghanistan. The United States has run out of political capital to do much more in the Pakistan-Afghanistan space. It spent 20 years there. I've just written a book, Niche Wars, Australia in Afghanistan and Iraq in this period. And Australia has spent capital in that space as well. And we're now, tail between our legs and packing up and bringing people home. India has to decide for itself how it manages this. But I think there is an enduring point here. And we know India is engaged in Afghanistan and has been for a number of years now in the pursuit of its own interests. But here's the other thing. The geography of India is of enduring consequence, and it matters enormously to China to keep India from interfering in China's expansion and in its freedom of action, particularly across the Indian Ocean, in and around India's territory. And of course, India has considerable agency here. And I'm thinking here about the position, not just the trade routes, the sea lines of communications that cover down the southern tip of India, but across at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, where the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are, where India has the potential to play a very important role in monitoring and, if needs be, checking China's freedom of action. So, when you think about what China does to India, what we saw over the last summer in the line of actual control in the Himalayas points to the competition between China and India. And as India weighs up the consequence of that competition, it needs to say, well, how much do we get annoyed at the United States for not doing more about Pakistan? And how much do we weigh up in our own interests what we need to do to be able to check China's increased influence and power and be able to assert what is in India's interests in the pursuit of its Look East policy and its managing of its challenges to the West. Thanks.
Thank you. If there are no more comments from the panelists, I'll have to bring the session to an end.
I wanted to just add on to what John said. I think it was an excellent comment to show the extent of India's possible contribution, especially in the maritime domain in the Andaman and Nicobar. And I think when India started saying Act East, some people had like inflated the expectation that the Indian Navy will be doing something in the Taiwan Strait contingency and things like that. But I think the expectations are well managed on both the US side and the Indian side, and also on the Japanese side. I think that the modest expectation about India's role in East is a key to this. I think inflated expectation will lead to disappointment and on both sides, Indian side and the US side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to sort of end this with one brief comment. There was some discussion about non-alignment as holding back, India's policies towards the Indo-Pacific. I think to begin with, non-alignment is really not a holy cow anymore, no pun intended here. We think of more in terms of strategic autonomy these days. So we keep talking about multi-alignment, strategic autonomy. So non-alignment is really not the driver of any major thinking, as it were, in the Indian context today. If at all, I think the currency is really decreasing. But having said that, I think when it comes to China, India's worry is not really about India's worry is also about the fact that India is next door to China. It's a major economic partner as far as India is concerned. And there is a certain regional dynamics. There is Nepal, there is Myanmar, there is Sri Lanka. India is located in the region. I think it has to navigate the difficulties of this economic partnership with China and the regional dynamics very, very carefully. And this is something that I think, Ms. Paskal, that came out in your survey, also in your presentation, you said that there is a difference in how the political and economic communities sort of perceive China and how the intel and military communities perceive China. I think that is precisely the dilemma that India also faces, because we are not, located in sort of spaces, geopolitical spaces that many of your countries are located. We are located next door to China. So I think it would take a lot more careful navigation from the Indian side to make up its mind on how to go about dealing with some of these opportunities and challenges. With that, may I thank all the panelists, Professor Blaxland, Sato-san, Dr. Gunasekara-Rockwell, Ms. Paskal, and Nagao-san. Excellent presentations. I think we had a fantastic conversation. And thank you, NICE, for organizing this. And thank you for all the questions from the audience. Very informative, very interesting. And you have a nice afternoon, nice evening, whatever the case may be. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.